Thank you for joining me here this evening. I'm Monica, and joining me in this presentation is Sandeep, Arya, Savani, Sunaina, and Lenol. For our presentation, we are going to talk about one of the most inspiring leaders the world has ever seen. Cambridge-educated lawyer who was strong-willed and a visionary leader who was famous for getting it done. Under his leadership, his nation metamorphosed itself from a tropical backwater with few natural resources to a first world metropolis in just one generation. He is Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of modern Singapore. He was the first Prime Minister of Singapore, governing for 3 decades, which made him the longest serving Prime Minister in world history. So let's get started this presentation by watching a short video.
In a tumultuous time of change, he led a nation.
I have a few million people's lives to account for, and Singapore will survive.
And spearheaded its transformation.
He is one of the finest leaders of the 20th century.
The man,
He is an outstanding character.
A man of total rectitude, high intelligence.
his life,
People think of him as being very stern and very strict. I don't think we ever felt that.
When you needed him, he was there. He was a key person in the family.
and his enduring legacy.
This is your life and mine. I've spent a whole lifetime building this.
To the young and to the not so old, I say, look at that horizon. Follow that rainbow. Go ride it.
Lee Kuan Yew, born as Harry Lee Kuan Yew, or commonly referred to LKY, was born in Singapore on 16 September 1923. He is the fourth generation Singaporean with Chinese ancestry. His ancestors emigrated from Dabu County in China to Singapore in 1863. Lee is the oldest son of Lee Chin Kun and Chua Jim Nyo. While he was still in his teens, Lee became de facto head of the family, which taught him to take decisions for the household. Growing up as the oldest among others in the family, Lee spent most of his childhood times playing games such as kites, fighting fish with his neighbors, which made him realize that these games nurture his fighting spirit and the will to win. So, talking about his education, Lee Kuan Yew's grandmother had strong views on his education since he was little. Before he was 6, he joined Chinese schools, then entered Tulukura English School. Lee continually topped his class with effortless ease. Upon his secondary school in Raffles Institute, Lee topped the Cambridge senior exams and won 2 awards. During his final year at Raffles Institute, he had already developed an interest in politics. After he finished his secondary school, he was planning to study law in London. But this ambition was frustrated by the outbreak of war. So instead, Lee entered Raffles College on scholarship. During Japanese occupation in Singapore, Lee held several roles, including a clerk typist, English language editors, black market commodities broker, and manufacturer gum. After Japan was defeated in 1945, Lee applied and was accepted into one of the London Inns of Court. He then left for England and enrolled at the London University before settling in Cambridge University Law School. He finished his 3 years law degree in 2.5 years, achieving double star first-class honors. He was then married secretly with Miss Kwa in 1947 before returning to Singapore to practice law. So now I'm going to hand it over to Sandeep.
Thank you, Monica. And in this slide, we'll discuss about different influences on Lee's life. And the first one is family. Lee was very much influenced by his grandfather and parents. His grandfather had a tough life, but he always pampered Lee. On the other hand, his father was a very disciplined man with a violent temper. His mother had a strong character and she always wanted Lee to take part in family matters so that he can develop better decision-making skills. Now the other influence is Japanese occupation of Singapore from 1942 to 1945, and during this time Lee experienced and observed the cruelness and unfairness of Japanese towards Singaporean people, and he was determined to change that. Now, the major influence is British colonial society time, during which he obtained his education and he received 2 prestigious scholarships, which acted as a foundation stone for him to act as a lawyer. As soon as Lee finishes his studies, He decided to return to Singapore to work as a lawyer and started working as a legal advisor in a law firm. In the year 1951, he was the election agent for British Progressive Party. In the year 1954, he was the junior counsel for Fajar trial, and with the huge success of the trial, he gained widespread reputation as the hero of High. Later on, in the same year, on 12th of November, People's Action Party was established, and because of his profession and huge reputation, he became the General Secretary of People's Action Party. Before independence, Singapore was British colony and was ruled by a government-assisted legislative council, and the members were appointed rather than elected. But in year 1955, new constitution increased the number of elected seats, and by winning the seat, Lee became the member of delegation team. Then in year 1959, when national election happened, Lee won majority of the seat and became the first Prime Minister of the Singapore. Now, separation with Malaysia was one of the disappointment to Lee. Singapore was part of Federation of Malaysia in 1963, but Malaysian government was troubled by Singaporeans' Chinese majority and People's Action political changes. And due to this, many riots happened in 1965. So, to avoid further distress and bloodshed, the separation of Singapore to Malaysia was decided. Now, handing over to Arya.
Thank you, Sandeep. Lee Kuan Yew, recognized as the nation's founding father, whose powerful traits drove followers to devote themselves to revolutionary changes transitioning the country from a developing third world country into a developed first world country. He was charismatic and transformational at the same time, along with the ability to adapt with changing times. He was a visionary leader who always encouraged people's development by being supportive and positive towards new innovations. It is because of his contribution today, Singapore is one of the richest, the cleanest, the least corrupt and an attractive global city. Lee Kuan Yew had a strong and unique insight into the future. His vision was to nurture Singapore carefully and develop its legacy as the world's economic hub. He made Singapore a corruption-free country. He also had a vision to make Singapore the business hub of the world. To fulfill his dream, he encouraged multinational companies to establish their businesses in Singapore and provided low tax incentives and business-free environment for foreign investors. Singapore is a small country with no natural resources except human resources. Lee Kuan Yew focused on developing human resources in terms of education and technologies. He was evident in investing in teachers and teachers' education to develop them into effective teachers, specialists, and leaders. He believed in student-centered and value-centric education. Indeed, his focus on world-class education was monumental in grooming people's development in Singapore. Further, to control increasing population, he introduced the two-child policy in 1970 and encouraged couples to have no more than 2 children. But it impacted in population structure of Singapore in a negative manner, so he introduced other policies such as 3 or more children if you can afford, that aimed at bringing population growth back on its track. Singapore public housing was a success. Lee Kuan Yew contributed into transitioning villages to high-rise living and resettling residents into low-cost state-built housing. The Housing Development Board provided home ownership scheme in 1996 to assist people in buying their apartments on 99 years of lease and provided national pension plan for their down payments. At present, around 78.9% Singaporeans live in a public residential development. Moving on to the military reform, the Singapore Army was established on 23rd December 1965. In 1967, the National Service Policy was introduced in Singapore, which required all male Singaporean citizens and second-generation permanent residents to serve a period of compulsory service in a uniformed services. This helped in building up a strong army to secure the borders. Now, I would like to hand it over to Shravani.
Thank you, Arya. Moving on to economic reforms, one of the major tasks post-colonization was to provide employment opportunities to the population. You galvanized Singaporean economy through following measures: promoting tourism, boosting production and local industries, and establishing world-class infrastructure to attract direct foreign investment. With the aid of his economic advisor, Hans Sen, and a Dutch economist, Albert Mensemes, Yu advanced production and built modern infrastructure to attract multinational corporations, which resulted in electronic giants like Hewlett-Packard, General Electric, Siemens, and Texas Instruments establishing business in Singapore. He also established steel mills and service industries like Neptune Orient Lines and Singapore Airlines. Financial stability was promised to foreign banks through macroeconomic management and by delivering budget surpluses. In his leadership, Singapore witnessed a tremendous rise of GDP from 2,200 US dollars in 1960 to 60,000 US dollars in 1990. The projection shows upward growth in Singapore's economic graph, shifting from labor intensive to innovation based in just 3 decades. Healthcare. You firmly believed that free healthcare was not a right strategy since you observed that people made systematic efforts in recovery only if they had to pay for professional advice. So he introduced MediSave, a co-payment scheme for Singaporeans comprising 6% of a person's monthly income as a state share in health fund capped at $15,000. Lesser amenity facilities in public hospitals were subsidized more than the luxurious ones, and as people's incomes increased, more and more people opted for luxurious, less subsidized healthcare. Private use of MediSave was permitted, except for GP, which made public healthcare more competitive. With introduction of MediShield for devastating illnesses and MediFund if MediSave and MediShield were exhausted, even expensive healthcare was made accessible to all. Foreign relations. Since the primary population of Singapore comprised of Chinese, Malays, and Indians, Yu made conscious efforts to maintain cordial relations with China, Malaysia, and India. Despite their rocky past with Malaysia, he was successful in establishing bilateral ties with the then Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman. He also developed close friendship with US Presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and strengthened economic and strategic ties with the US. Being a Chinese descendant himself, he wished to nurture close ties with China, but feared Singapore being viewed as Third China and chose not to openly support it since Singapore's alliance with the communist state would ruin their friendship with the West. Despite his anti-communist views, Yu went on to establish strong ties with the country and was conferred the China Reform Friendship Medal posthumously. This was all for my part, handing over to Sunana.
Thank you, Shravani. I would like to continue with how Lee Kuan Yew's speeches motivate people. He always felt the duty to state his conviction vigorously, to choose between platitudes and personal convictions, and influence the people in Singapore to overthrow the system if left frustrated and underprivileged. And he believed that empires do not last forever, and his generation would see the last imperialism in Southeast Asia. He urged racial harmony in creating unions for intelligence and education to enable rapid acquisition of wealth and economic success. He also aspired democratic and egalitarian society free of association, speech, and publication. And he was a supporter of opportunity for all based on competition and which was free of discrimination and reward based on active contribution. And now, talking about the outcome, he transferred Singapore into one of the most advanced countries in the world, with the growth of GDP from nearly 5,000 in 1980 to more than 50,000 in 2013. He established Central Provident Fund that stands at the present with contribution of 15.5% of employees' gross salary from the employer and 50% from the employee. The fund is utilized by the government in Singapore's modern infrastructure, including transport system, high-tech industrial and public parks, housing and education. Consequently, Singapore has the best housing in Asia with 80% of home ownership. And Singapore's healthcare system is ranked by Bloomberg in 2014 as the most efficient in the world. And Singapore's economic growth as of 2017 is 5.2%. with no government debt after 1995. Now talking about his legacy motivating Singapore in maintaining a first world status, Lee Kuan Yew has a compelling vision of established effective communication that focused on equal employment and educational opportunities for everyone. And He believed that the outcome should be based on competition devoid of discrimination, believing on democracy unconditionally. And he also believed that developing people as Singapore's greatest and only natural resources. He also advocated robust succession planning to continue to thrive because there is no long-term success without a capable successor. With this, I would like to request Lionel to continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunana. So I will be covering Lee Kuan Yew's legacy of controversies. Like any successful leader, the Prime Minister of Singapore was no stranger to controversies. He was hailed by many as a man who urbanized Singapore from a backwater island to a world-renowned metropolitan city. Yet, still there were many detractors that did try to overthrow him. There were tall shadows of controversies linked to Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew during his governance, among which 4 I will be discussing in details that are considered most controversial, creating issues and public disagreement because of wide divergent opinions. Let's start with the first controversy known as Operation Cold Store. This was a code name for covert security operation carried out in 1963, leading to the arrest of 107 anti-colonial and politicians without any trial. But that action was justified by the authorities as necessary to protect against any attempt by the communists to mount violence or disorder to destabilize the government. The second controversy is eugenics, which Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew assumed that Singapore needs a system that educates citizens for different roles to support the economy. And he also believed that intelligence was innate and inherited, giving rise to the eugenics program. For example, giving incentive for the sterilization of mothers without ordinary level of education, and giving tax rebate to graduate mothers, which therefore was justified by the future economic success they were sure to bring to the country by virtue of having more intelligent workforce. Third controversial strategy imposed by the Prime Minister was Certificate of Entitlement or COE. In Singapore, hitting the road in a new vehicle was a complicated matter because you must first place a bid for COE, which entitles you the right to register, own, and use a vehicle in Singapore for the duration of 10 years. This allowed Singapore to regulate the number of vehicles crowding its roadways so that the traffic congestion does not reach an uncontrollable level. Lastly, the Prime Minister's Islamophobic opinion that stirred public controversy, in which he holds problematic views about the Malay Muslim community. That insight gave him a bad impression from the public that he is more than intolerant and discriminatory towards the Muslim, as he described in his book published in 2011 entitled Hard Truths to Keep Singapore Going. He also tried to argue that Muslims were less integrated into Singapore than any other racial and religious community. To conclude this presentation, I would like to show a short video about the legacy of the renowned father of Singapore, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew. Thank you, and please enjoy.
Singapore is a very small country, but his influence reaches far beyond Singapore, far beyond the ASEAN countries, far beyond China and Japan, about which he knows a great deal, and goes all across Europe and across the United States. So I think of him as a global leader.
Lee Kuan Yew is a statesman in his own area and in the Asian context generally, but also on a world scale. He's very well known in the United States and throughout Europe. In South Africa, he's invited everywhere. And people go to Singapore, I go to Singapore, in considerable part to see him.
Well, when I think of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, I think that everyone, in fact, everyone in the world, of importance, regard him as one of the great Asian leaders in the last half of the 20th century.
李总理啊，他是一个智慧极高，又坦诚坚定，同时具他非常有抱负。他这个抱负的这个做法同这个叛逆，所以 实在是一个当时我讲是个贤明的政治领袖，所以他不仅是在新加坡深得荣望，并且在世界上他的声望，他国家虽小，他个人的政治声望在世界的政治领域呢，那是非常高的。
Lee Kuan Yew, in my opinion, was one of the foremost statesmen of his century. Really, very, very remarkable man. Of course, he got a considerable intellect. I mean, a brilliant mind. But he was a man of such a broad intellect that, you know, he could pick up a topic and talk to anybody about anything under the sun. Fascinating man.
You know, you say Lee Kuan Yew, everybody knows who he is. You say Singapore, some people do not know where we are, right? But this is a brand that is, I think multinationals would love to have, you know. I mean, you have Microsoft, you have Google, but Lee Kuan Yew is almost like a man unto himself. I think that's the beauty of what Singapore has. Although we are a small country, what we have managed to throw up, we have thrown up a brand like Mr. Lee Kuan Yew.